When starting my new company, should I worry about what the ecosystem is in the community that might support me to do that? That's a big question with big consequences. And we're going to address that in this episode of Top of Mind when we reveal an exciting new channel on the Kauffman website, entrepreneurship.org, called ID8 Nation. Then we're going to sit down with Head of Research and Policy here at the Foundation, Dane Stangler, to understand how the work of their researchers are informing what's happening at the city level. I'm Thom Ruhe, and this is Top of Mind. If you've been following the research that we're publishing at the Kauffman Foundation, at least over the last 12 months, you will be noticing a certain theme to it. Namely, that there's a certain geography analysis to entrepreneurship, or founder mobility options that founders have in picking where they're going to start their new companies. So it's no surprise that research like this informs the programs that we do here at the Foundation. And it really was the inspiration to an exciting new channel that we're putting on entrepreneurship.org called ID8 Nation. With the ID8 Nation channel, we're going to be featuring and showcasing cities around the country that are doing exciting things to support the birth of new companies and the growth of these young companies that are getting started right there in their community. We started the channel with the debut of Pittsburgh, where we tell the story of how this gritty city came from a steel background to become a hub of innovation, technology, and new firm formation. Let's take a look.
Everyone from my dad back had worked in the steel industry at one point.
We're all building companies to compete on a global level.
Investors do not want their money to be tuition.
The notion of government funding businesses, I think most people will laugh at.
We worked hard to be a direct source of capital to startups.
ID8 Nation goes to Pittsburgh to explore what works and what doesn't in its entrepreneurial ecosystem. We find a city with no shortage of ideas and aspiring entrepreneurs.
Sometimes you need to just give an entrepreneur an opportunity to be successful.
But Pittsburgh also faces some significant challenges before it can realize its full potential.
We don't have the necessary capital to continue to grow and build companies here.
Is there enough talent?
We're having to face this whole thing all over again of people wanting to take our talent away.
Is government doing the right things?
I think one of the things that, again, I think could be helpful is getting matching dollars from government sources.
And can a city built around big corporations embrace entrepreneurship? That mix of progress and pitfalls makes Pittsburgh ideal for ID8 Nation's first issue. Come in and see what we've found.
Today on Top of Mind, I am joined by Head of Research and Policy here at the Kauffman Foundation, Dane Stangler. Dane, thank you so much for joining us today on Top of Mind.
Thank you.
In the intro to this episode, I talked about the importance of regional ecosystems and how that can impact, startups and companies that are trying to scale and grow. And really that was a big motivation to us launching ID8 Nation in the way we did. I was hoping you could share, with Top of Mind viewers, from your perspective in the research and the data that your group collects and analyzes and reports on, why is it important to an entrepreneur to understand the ecosystem that they choose to start in?
So part of this has been a learning process for us. So I can tell you about how we as a research group have approached this, and then what we've learned from entrepreneurs and young companies. We've done a considerable amount of work looking at the impact of policy on entrepreneurs, mostly at the federal level. It's become readily apparent to us that while federal policy matters, and while that gets a lot of attention from the press, from politicians, policymakers, from people trying to help entrepreneurs, the biggest barriers, the biggest factors that matter for entrepreneurs when they're looking to start a company, when they're looking to grow a company, are those local level factors. And they're not all policy barriers. Private action, programs available in the community. So we've learned a lot from working with entrepreneurs that what matters is what's immediately around you. Because when you're starting a company, you may think about sort of 30,000-foot policy levels, but Not very often. What you think about is what you're facing at the ground level. And so we've come to that not only through research, but also talking to entrepreneurs in various cities and communities around the country.
You know, we've both been here, several years, and I think one of the things that I've intuited from the work that your group does is a lot of times, you are debunking, conventional wisdom or myths or, let's just say, assumptions that people have about what the typical entrepreneur is or what the typical ecosystem is. Can you talk a little bit about the work that we've done, whether it's been with Inc. 500 data, Ernst & Young or other partners we worked in, and maybe what some of the more, let's just say, surprising, findings that you've had have been?
Right, so we often like to think of ourselves as mythbusters, and this is a good role to play. You mentioned earlier we'd done some research on the geography of entrepreneurship, and when you say that phrase, most people, man on the street, person in a policy position is going to think about sort of those, the usual suspects: Silicon Valley, New York, Boston, Austin. Oh, the geography of entrepreneurship, that must be these few places. And what we found, looking at fast growth companies, Inc. 500, and then other rapidly growing companies, the Ernst & Young companies, which tend to be slightly older and slightly bigger, what we found, surprising to a lot of people, is that you find entrepreneurs and young companies and fast-growing companies all over the country. Now, at one level, that shouldn't be surprising. We've got a big country, people live everywhere, there's economic activity everywhere, but this comes as a surprise to a lot of people.
You mean it doesn't all just happen in Silicon Valley?
So that's the usual reaction, right? And I think that was... it was partially a surprise to us, right? Because we didn't expect, I think, to find as wide a range geographic distribution as we did. And it goes the same way with the types of companies. Most people think about entrepreneurs or startups or fast-growing companies only in tech, and we found that not only are they distributed across the country, but those entrepreneurs are distributed across all different sectors across all parts of the country. And so you find these surprising pockets of entrepreneurial activity in all corners of the country.
Speaking of that, have there been any trends that you've identified that maybe a particular sector is concentrating in a particular geography of the country? Have we seen sector alignments? I think I recall from the report, like in the Beltway area, I suppose not surprisingly, a concentration of government consulting, contracting type companies. Have there been any other correlations that came out of the research that might surprise people to know?
Sure, that was probably the biggest one in Washington, D.C. On one level, not a surprise. Rapid expansion in government spending in the last 10 years, especially on defense, has led to not only a lot of government contractors, which it could be anything, but also a lot of tech companies in the Washington area, and it's sort of now on the technology map. I hate to say out-of-the-way places, but what people usually don't think of as entrepreneurial hotspots, places like Baltimore, places like Indianapolis showed up highly with fast-growing Inc. companies. Chicago, which has a vibrant startup scene but hasn't sort of penetrated that top tier of cities that people think of, showed up with lots of fast-growing companies. Salt Lake City and Provo, Utah were probably the most concentrated area that came out of this research. Those show up in a lot of other people's research, but to see that density, that entrepreneurial density, was partly a surprise to us, and I think a surprise to a lot of people, because again, Provo, Salt Lake City, those don't often come to mind when you're talking about entrepreneurship.
Yeah, you mentioned Provo. Just as a side note, I noticed, I think Provo, and I think I'm correct in saying this, is now the third city that Google has identified as the next target for Google Fiber.
That's right.
I wonder if they're paying attention to our research and selecting the cities that they're rolling out to. Maybe you can share a little bit for the viewers. So now if we consider these communities where this is happening, what kind of institutions? Is there a type, is it an economic development organization? Is it an incubator, an accelerator? Is it, a research university? Like, what types of institutions are having, big influence in these communities where you're seeing this concentration happening?
So this is kind of where we see, you can talk about it as necessary but not sufficient institutions. research universities are clearly important to a lot of these places. I mean, you talk about Provo and Salt Lake City. You know, BYU has played a very large role in the entrepreneurial ecosystem there. When you think about the usual suspects, Silicon Valley, you think of Stanford. Boston, you think of MIT. In the Washington area, not so much, right? There's not necessarily an anchor institution. The anchor institution there is the government and sort of plays the role of a surrogate university. When you think about places like Kansas City, same thing, not necessarily an anchor research university in the city itself, but other companies in that case have played the role of surrogate universities. So I think the pattern you see is not necessarily you must have a research university or you must have a government lab or a government agency, is that you have to have that interaction between whatever institution your community has, university, government, a big company, interaction between that and the entrepreneurial community. So sort of two-way movement, right? The porous boundaries that lots of people talk about.
Were there other, things that stood out? Like, we always hear, or we hear a lot, I should say, access to capital, is a barrier perceived or otherwise. Did anything like that stick out in the communities that, were showing this growth? Like, were there a benefit or an advantage on access to capital or some sort of local regulatory environment? Anything that comes, to your mind on that?
Sure. So you know better than I that access to capital is a perpetual complaint among entrepreneurs, but it's sort of an answer to one of those open-ended questions. No one's ever going to say they don't need more money. And sometimes if they're saying that's the answer, then that indicates that's a symptom of other problems that they're facing, right? I mean, you know that better than I. The one aspect of capital that the researchers in this Inc. research, at least in the Inc. 500 research, did find was venture capital, which is often assumed to be sort of a prerequisite to an entrepreneurial community or startup boom, is not a prerequisite.
What?
It's important.
Myth busting again.
Sit down for this.
All right.
It's important. Obviously, it's played a large role in Silicon Valley and in Boston and New York, but it's certainly not a piece that must be in place, for startups or for entrepreneurs to take off. I think the other common pattern we found, and so now I'm going to sort of stray from the quantitative research into sort of more my impressions and qualitative research, is that it's the connections in a community. And I think we've seen this in Kansas City. I think we see this in Pittsburgh that has been highlighted in the ID8 Nation video that has recently launched, is those connections. And one way to think about this, and I didn't come up with this, but one way I like to think about this and sort of reading other people is you can think of a city like a brain, right? The neurons in your brain are obviously important for your brain to function, but they can't function without connections to other neurons. That's the essence of how your brain functions, are the connections between the neurons. And it's the exact same thing in a city, in a neighborhood, in a metropolitan area, in a region. You can have a research university, you can have a great venture capital firm, you can have a great, whatever it is, but if those places aren't connected, it's not going to matter what your assets are.
I think we've jumped on this bandwagon you referenced here in Kansas City. We launched 1 million cups a year ago now, and we're spreading into other cities. I think, this is a bit of a selfless or shameful plug, but, I think we're proving that here in things like the rollout of 1 million cups and the connections that are happening and the collision of networks. Is there any advice that you could offer from your vantage point? And I'm not asking this in like you have solid data, your instincts are as good as any others, I'd say even better informed based upon the work you do. Is there any advice you would have to communities that are watching this, that first are probably asking, well, why did you guys go to Pittsburgh first? Or, how does my community catalyze, the neuron connectivity, so to speak? What would you say to, community leaders that might be watching this today that they could do?
We talked about myth busting earlier, and I think one of the great advantages of doing entrepreneurship research, especially at the city level, is there's such a great opportunity for places like Kauffman and our partners to make good contributions, because so many people make conclusions, recommendations based on either no data or terrible data. So it's okay, right, for us to make conclusions on impressions and qualitative research, because we're trying to dig up information that hasn't been dug up or that no one has paid attention to. The biggest thing I think that we've learned from 1 Million Cups, attending it every week, surveying the participants, is how simple it is for a city to catalyze an entrepreneurial ecosystem. It doesn't have to be the mayor. It could be the mayor. It could be anyone in the city. And I visited Pittsburgh recently, and I think we see this in Pittsburgh, and I think you've seen it too in your interactions with the city leaders there, is that cities and states and regions, counties spend so much money on economic development, whether it's attracting this big company or attracting a new office for an overseas company, or trying to retain jobs that might otherwise leave. Millions of dollars are spent on these tax incentives. Yet you look at something like 1 million cups, like other entrepreneurship programs, and it costs a cup of coffee simply to open the doors of a place and to watch those connections happen. There's a little bit of facilitation takes place, but it's orders of magnitude cheaper and easier than all the stuff we already do for regional economic development.
So I'm going to take this opportunity to confirm something you said, because viewers of Top of Mind may remember border wars and incentives into kind of attraction and retention has been an earlier topic, and I've opined on this in this channel before that literally communities are spending millions of dollars in tax abatements, thereby gutting other social programs to have a zero-sum game, because they're just stealing a company across a border. Imagine if we took a fraction of that, namely the cost of a cup of coffee, right, and invested in organic growth. I think that's probably one of the biggest, just to affirm what you've already said, the biggest learnings we've had with 1 million cups. And it's not, there's no secret, intellectual property there, right? I think if I reflect on what you just said, I think communities might be overthinking this, and just step forward and start making the connectivity. I'd like to wind up this episode by having you foreshadow a little bit some of the research priorities that you see coming, coming up in your group, and maybe the motivation behind it and what that is.
Sure. So one of the things we're working on is trying to understand and identify what cities can do. And we've talked about one, open the doors of a place, cost of a cup of coffee, whatever it may be. Stop overthinking things. What else can cities do? When you talk to entrepreneurs about what barriers do you face, what challenges you face, sometimes it's access to capital, sometimes it's talent, sometimes it's finding a customer. But oftentimes, if you're talking about a policy barrier, it's nuts and bolts kind of things like a zoning code or enforcement of codes in the city, and it's either very easy or it's terrible. And cities haven't really thought that way of how to design their zoning, their codes for new and young companies. It's always been either for simply dividing city up by different uses or mixing those uses, or for large established companies. And that's fine, that's not necessarily an indictment, but now as we're sort of underway in this, we're really in the early stages of a new entrepreneurial transformation in the US, and it's being driven at the community level. How do we start to design those things that were born in a different era, tailored to different needs for new and young companies, and how to promote that community building? Along with that, we're trying to identify the types of private programs. So there's public policy arena, and there's things like that Kauffman can do, universities can do, and so we're trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work for helping entrepreneurs, for helping new companies, for calling out more entrepreneurs. And we're certainly not going to get to, nor do we intend to get to some sort of best practice, like you can only do this and this never works, but try to understand the things that do work and don't work so we can be more helpful to entrepreneurs and communities.
Well, that's certainly helpful, and I appreciate you taking some time to sit in the seat today, so to speak, on Top of Mind, and sharing your views with the audience. For those of you who are tuning in to see the launch of ID8 Nation Pittsburgh, I hope you enjoy it. I'll give you a hint here that if you're curious what the next city is going to be, it's going to be San Diego. I'm not going to tell you when that's happening, but it's going to be coming up. And if you're interested in having your city featured in ID8 Nation, drop me an email. It's Ruhe, Truhe, at Kauffman, Kauffman.org. Dane, thanks so much for joining us on Top of Mind today.
Thanks for having me.